A thread by Carlos Osuida. Cognitive rigidity. It's the fatal flaw of liberalism. President Trump exploits it mercilessly, as he should. This thread is in response to a Tim Pool video entitled Trump Calls for National Guard to End Rioting in Portland. Chicago Mayor Refuses to Help Ending Riots. Quote from the video, quote, I wish Trump was a man of better preparedness. He's off the cuff, doesn't know how the system works properly, and is ill prepared for the role of the presidency. End quote. Carlos responds, this is unforgivable refusal to face reality. The funny thing is that Tim spends all his time telling others that they've swallowed the media narrative. I've said this before, but Trump spent 4 decades preparing for the presidency. The New York Times profile from 1984 is all you need to read. From New York Times in 1984, The Expanding Empire of Donald Trump. I've also made an audio version of this New York Times piece. I'll also put the link in the description. Carlos quotes from the article, quote, what sets Trump apart, says Ben V. Lambert, a real estate investment banker, is his ability to pierce through the canvas and get things done. He gets projects literally off the ground while others are having meetings and doing feasibility studies. But his real skill is putting together complex pieces of the puzzles, financing, zoning, parcels of land, and such. This ethereal part of building is perhaps more important than the brick and mortar, end quote. But Trump was ill prepared for the presidency, says Tim, the great and terrible. From the article again, quote, oddly enough, for all of those who criticize his buildings as not in the best of taste, architecture critics have generally hailed them. In her review of the glass and chrome Grand Hyatt, for example, Ada Louise Huxtable spoke of the building's ingenuity and excellence and elegance and called it urbane and elegant in New York. End quote. He just got lucky, says Tim, the great and terrible. Quote, his last appointment of the day is a committee meeting of the New York Vietnam Veterans Memorial Commission. He walks in late to a conference room at Price Waterhouse and Company, the accounting firm, where a group of about 10 men, most of whom look to be corporate junior executives about his age, tired-looking young men with their ties loosened after a long day at the office, gathered around a conference table. Mr. Trump is the co-chairman, but he has not been to many of the meetings, and although they don't show it, some of the committee members are peeved. The meeting has already begun when he strolls in. There are written reports on the table about design contests and a fundraising campaign for a memorial. A good deal of hand-wringing is going on over how in the world to raise even a small portion of the $1.4 million needed. The men are stating the need to energize that component of the campaign, to plug into that sector, to interface. Mr. Trump does not take off his coat and slouches in a chair. When he finally speaks up, he says that he is on the commission because the young men who went to Vietnam got a bad deal, about the worst thing that can happen to anyone. He then throws out the names of some people, friends of mine, whom they could probably tap for substantial contributions. Then we're going to have the fundraiser at Trump Tower, he says, punching through the canvas. I've called the White House. The president is coming, so we can raise the price of the 800 tickets from $500 to $1,000. That'll just about put you where you want to be. I have to be going, he says. All of the men stare silently at him as he stands and picks up a copy of the afternoon newspaper on the conference table, looking at his photograph on both the front and back pages, then taken at the sports forum where the men called out his name. End quote. But Trump is disorganized and doesn't know how the system works, says Tim, the great and terrible. Quote, he does not seem to write anything down. keeping volumes of company files as mental notes, end quote. But Trump was unprepared for the presidency, says Tim, the great and terrible. Why did Trump become president? Tim doesn't know why. Even if he knew why, it wouldn't change his mind. He's cognitively rigid. Quote, the football thing is cute. Trump Tower and the piano and all of that. It's all cute. But what does it mean? He says, sounding what borders on a note of uncharacteristic despair. Asked to explain, he adds, what does it all mean when some wacko over in Syria can end the world with nuclear weapons? He says that his concern for a nuclear holocaust is not one that popped into his mind during any recent made-for-television movie. He says that it has been troubling him since his uncle, a nuclear physicist, began talking to him about it 15 years ago in 1969. Quote, his greatest dream is to personally do something about the problem. And characteristically, Donald Trump thinks he has an answer to nuclear armament. Let him negotiate arms agreements. He who can talk people into selling $100 million properties to him for $13 million. Negotiation is an art, he says, and I have a gift for it. The idea that he would ever be allowed to go into a room alone and negotiate for the United States, let alone be successful in disarming the world, seems the naive musing of an optimistic, deluded young man who has never lost at anything he has tried. But he believes that through years of making his views known and through supporting candidates who share his views, it should someday happen. End quote. Trump should be Tim Pool's hero. Instead, Tim feels contempt for him based on nothing but Tim's own head. Trump first made contact with the Saudi royal family in 1980 at the latest. I seem to be the only person outside of Trump's circle and the House of Saud who knows this. Not one other person has ever looked into it. Trump and the Saudis began planning on how to fix the world in 1980 at the latest. Trump became a Democrat to learn about them, to have them tell him all their secrets, to spy on them. As for being president, Tim Pool has absolutely no idea how the system works. Trump delegates authority to his subordinates, the first president in American history to do so. Mike Pence is co-president. All the cabinet secretaries are autonomous after they receive the overall strategy. Nikki Haley never asked Trump for permission. He told her he trusted her judgment, and that was that. Whenever a president of either party begins to inevitably fail, his supporters always say the same thing. America is ungovernable. It's too big. No. Our presidents were too small. All they really cared about was their legacy. Trump spends nothing on the usual billionaire toys and indulgences. All he cares about is getting the job done. He is the first entirely selfless president. When people talk long enough, they reveal their limitations. I like Tim Pool, but he hit the wall in terms of development. The only thing I would say to him as a man 25 years older is that when I was 50, I discovered that my entire life, everything I thought was true was a lie. I had to junk everything, and I did. There was never any thought of quitting. I was going to be goddamned if I was going to let everything have been a giant rook, a ripoff, a fabrication. So I began researching what had happened. There's an interesting phenomenon that occurs if you stay calm. The deeper you dig and the worse it gets, the easier it becomes. You get smarter. The patterns become clearly visible. Finally, you can look at a single photo and know exactly what it means. The last thing I had to admit to myself before I was entirely free of my false life was that the love of my life was the second most destructive predator I'd ever known. She stayed with me for 5 years because I was the best patsy she'd snared. The only reason she drove me away was that when I started having inklings of the falsity of my entire life, I spoke to her about it, and she freaked out. I was oriented toward people like her, and she was made by the same meat grinder I'd been through. Here's the best way to explain. The white supremacist mass shooter who killed 9 black churchgoers in Charleston on June 17th, 2015. Everything written about him is wrong. All that matters is his blank face. It's called flat affect. He is catastrophically mentally ill. Flat affect is caused only by the worst type of mental illness, psychosis. Mental illness in order of severity: neurosis, then disorder, then psychosis. Some spectrum disorders are functional psychoses. Psychiatry is hindered by the human frailty, vanity, and partisanship of its practitioners. We're at a low point in the history of mental health care. The doctors and nurses really can't be trusted. When I went to a talk therapist, I told him he had to hit me as hard as he could using his training. So he did. And it was effective. He was merciless but benign. It had to be done. And his diagnosis is that I'm wrecked beyond repair, which I already knew. I had to know. The truth must always be faced by seekers. You have no right to force truth on people. They must ask and be willing to take bad news. So, back to this mass shooter. He pleaded guilty in state court and was sentenced to 9 life terms. Feds didn't give him a deal. So his lawyers knew the only way to save him, since he'd confessed, and since the crime was premeditated and savage to the point of incomprehension, was to plead mental illness. The shooter refused to allow his mental state to be discussed. The jury found him guilty in 2 days after listening to his confession. During the sentencing phase, the mass murderer defended himself. He told the jurors to disregard everything his lawyers said. He said there was absolutely nothing wrong with him psychologically. So, he got the death penalty. Why did he do this? He was afraid people would think he was a weirdo. Being called mentally ill had damaged his reputation. That was in 2017. As he gets closer to his date with the needle, he's had a change of heart. In 2020, he appealed his conviction. On what grounds? Incompetent defense. He says his lawyers let an obviously mentally ill man defend himself. That is how terrified people are of being thought to be mentally ill. He's fine being a racist mass murderer, but not a weirdo. Well, I always knew that I was mentally ill, but I thought there was nothing I could do about it. A cardiologist put me on psychotropics. I didn't even know I had PTSD. That's how disoriented I was. My second psychiatrist was stunned that I have no criminal record. I should have been a serial killer or a spree killer. That was never in the cards. I was never angry at the world. I won't describe my thoughts, not fantasies, but they were an endless waking nightmare. I found peace of mind in medication and hermitude, and digging so far into the past that I could finally bury it. I'm now emotionally severed from the past. It's like an ancient historical era. I've written a memoir about all this. Unfortunately, the pandemic made it impossible for me to submit it to a literary agency right now, and I'm not going to self publish. I'm going big or nothing. I was doing okay before Trump came along as a presidential candidate, but he made me delirious with happiness. He and the Saudis and God and their allies are fixing the world, and the job will be finished before the end of Trump's second term. The cognitively rigid are missing out on the sheer magic of this moment. That's their problem, not mine. These are the days of miracle and wonder.